Hi, I'm Ryan Szymanski, curator for Battleship New Jersey Museum and Memorial. Today, our video is on the top 10 ships that I believe should have been preserved as museums. So, what are my criteria for this? First off, these are my opinions as an individual. They're not the museum's opinions. They're not anybody else's opinions. These are the ships that I think should have been saved. And they're all ships which had a chance of being saved. So many of these, they were proposed to be turned into museums, and for a number of reasons, it fell through. Just a reminder, I'm here in the United States, where we have the most museum ships of anywhere in the world. The bulk of the ships on my list are American, but I would love to hear from you guys. I know we've got a global audience out there. Which ships do you believe should have been saved as museums? I really want to see your lists down in the comment section down below. All right. So, starting out in the number 10 spot, and I should say, this list I'm specifically naming individual ships. I'm going to make another video that'll probably come up in another week or two where I talk about the top 10 types of ships that should be saved. So, for example, I believe Great Britain should have saved a battleship. I'm going to talk about that in a future video. This one is specifically, I am naming my top 10. And in the number 10 spot, I have USS Alden. Alden was a 4-stack destroyer. I absolutely adore the Four Pipers. I think they're gorgeous ships. I think they are one of the most uniquely American types of ships ever built. And these ships were built during World War I to help with the first U-boat menace. They served throughout the interwar period as the bulk of the U.S. Navy's scouting and screening destroyer force. And then at the very end of their life cycles, they served throughout World War II. In all theaters, a number of them met grisly ends. A number of them were converted into other jobs, aviation tenders, or anti-aircraft ships, or minesweepers or mine layers. And it was a large group of ships, over 250 of them, spread around a couple of different classes. And so I believe that the United States should have preserved a representative member of this class. I picked Alden on a whim. She was one of the ships that survived the war, and she was still more or less in her original configuration, which is why I picked her. I'm not sold on Alden as the representative 4-stacker. Maybe you guys have a different 4-piper that you would have liked to have seen. Let us know in the comment section down below. But she's my representative here. Alden was scrapped in 1945, and there was no movement to specifically save her as a museum. In 1945, there were no museum ships in the world. However, President Roosevelt had always wanted to create a national museum of the U.S. Navy in Washington, D.C., and his plan always included saving 5 ships. He wanted the cruiser Olympia, which was still around as a museum ship. He wanted USS Constitution, USS Constellation, which both survived as museum ships, USS Hartford, that's going to come up later on this list, and a 4-stack destroyer to show the more modern wars the ship was in. So that would cover vessels from the War of 1812 and the Barbary Wars, the Civil War, the Spanish-American War, World War I, and World War II, all in one museum, the major naval wars of this country with representative ships throughout. When he died, this plan was still in the works. He had a foundation set up to run it. Ships like the cruiser Olympia went into dry dock to be prepared for this museum. USS Hartford was moved from where she had been stored as a Hawk to D.C. for inclusion in this museum. But when he died, I won't say that the idea died with him, because people still push for this type of museum, but the impetus for doing it immediately ended, and here we are 80 years later, still without such a national museum. A number of people mention on here that they think it would be great if we grouped all of the museum ships into one museum. I think that's terrible. There are a couple of multi-ship museums that are operating successfully, but I would never take all of the museum ships or even a large number of museum ships and put them in one place. People who are into ships are going to go and see a ship, whether it's one vessel or two vessels or 10 vessels. People who aren't into ships are not going to come to the museum because there are 10 ships as opposed to one. So for the same number of visitors, you have multiple ships to take care of as opposed to a single one. The key to Roosevelt's museum idea was that it was probably going to be supported by the federal government and by the U.S. Navy. And maybe with government funding, a museum like this could be successful. Without government funding, there's no way that you could group ships that old together in one place and expect to be able to preserve them long term. Number 9. The battleship USS Washington. Washington was built just before World War II, or just before the United States entered World War II. She fought the Japanese battleship Kirishima during the naval battle of Guadalcanal and sunk her, and then she served throughout the rest of World War II. Shortly after the war, along with most of the other battleships, she was decommissioned. She was scrapped in 1961. By 1961, different states had formed commissions to save their respective battleships. Texas had been saved in 1948, and right around that same 1961 timeframe, North Carolina, Alabama, and Massachusetts all managed to save their ships. Washington was not saved, South Dakota was not saved, Indiana was not saved. Parts from South Dakota were salvaged. She could very easily be on this list in place of Washington, but we do have 2 South Dakota-class ships already. We do also have the other North Carolina-class battleship, North Carolina herself, which is why Washington is in the number 9 slot at the near the bottom of the list here. But she was a historically significant ship, unfortunately scrapped at the very, very beginning of the concept of a modern museum ship. Number 8. USS Barb. Museum ships are not necessarily preserved because they're the most historically significant vessel. I'm giving you a list of 10 historically significant vessels here, but the ones that are saved aren't necessarily important. Oftentimes we find reasons to make them important. For example, the submarine Torsk in Baltimore that I worked on for a period of time. She sank the last Japanese vessels of World War II. Is that enough of a reason to preserve a vessel? Arguably, no. How did she get preserved? She happened to be being disposed of at the time that the city of Baltimore was looking to create waterfront attractions. And so the city was able to acquire her. And it's great that she was preserved. There's something like 18 World War II fleet-type submarines preserved, and maybe half of them are historically significant. I'd argue that only 2 or 3 of them are really historically significant. If I had to pick 18 World War II-era submarines to save in the United States, I would maybe pick 3 off of the list that were actually saved. The one that wasn't saved that's on the top of my list here is USS Barb. Now, Barb is pretty low on my list in the number 8 slot because so many other fleet-type submarines exist, but she's the most historically significant, I feel, that was lost. She was Admiral Fluckey's boat, and she had, I believe, the 4th highest tonnage of kills for American submarines. Of course, Tang, with the highest tonnage of ships sunk, was lost herself during the war, and so could not be preserved. Barb wasn't scrapped until 1972, when the museum ship concept had proven viable in this country, and a number of museum ships were operating successfully. Following World War II, when Barb was decommissioned, she was given to Italy. And Italy operated her for a couple of years, and then in the 1970s sold her for $100,000 for scrap. And Admiral Fluckey famously said that had he and his crew known that the ship was being sold for scrap, they would have been able to raise the $100,000 to go and save her and turn her into a museum ship. And that has been successfully done by a number of museum groups. They've gone over to foreign countries that were still operating American ships, even into relatively recent times, and were able to acquire them and bring them back. USS Slater is perhaps the biggest example of that, although an LST was brought over under similar circumstances and is operating very effectively. So I have no doubts that had Fluckey known his boat was being scrapped, he could have garnered the support to open her as a museum, and she would have been successful and vastly significant. In the number 7 position, I have the battleship USS Oregon. McKinley's Bulldog served during the Spanish-American War and was famously able to run from the west coast of the United States all the way around South America, because we didn't have a Panama Canal yet, and join the Atlantic Fleet by sailing through the Caribbean and meeting up with the rest of the U.S. Navy. She could have easily been destroyed in detail by Spanish forces in the Caribbean if she had been caught. And she made that run at ridiculously high speeds for an old tub of a ship that was steam-powered by men shoveling coal into boilers. So the fact that her black gang, the soot-covered stokers, were able to maintain a high speed all the way around the American continent to get her to join the rest of the fleet is really significant. Their training, their experience in doing that, caused Oregon to be the fastest of the American battleships during the Battle of Santiago on July 3rd, 1898, when the Spanish cruiser squadron fled Santiago. So only the American armored cruisers and Oregon were able to chase them down effectively and damage them enough that the rest of the American fleet could catch them. And so Oregon was a hugely famous and popular ship in her day. In 1922, the Washington Naval Treaty would have caused her to be scrapped along with all of the other American pre-dreadnought battleships. And there are no pre-dreadnought battleships left in the United States. There's only one left in the world, the Japanese battleship Mikasa. And so in 1922, Washington Naval Treaty says she needs to be demilitarized. For most American battleships, that means scrapping. However, a clause in the treaty says that if you disable engineering, you disable the guns, you disable armor plating, functionally the ship is no longer a battleship, you can maintain her. And the U.S. Navy did this with a couple of other pre-dreadnoughts. However, in 1925, they determined that Oregon was the most historically significant of them, and they loaned her to the state of Oregon to be operated as a museum. So really, that makes Oregon the first steel-hauled warship museum in this country, possibly in the world. In 1942, the U.S. government retracted the loan because they thought the vessel would be more useful as scrap metal. So they took her on December 7th, 1942, the very day that Battleship New Jersey was launched, and they started to scrap her. About halfway through the process, after the superstructure and the guns and everything above the main deck had been removed, they got the idea that, hey, we're about to invade Guam. We could probably use this Hawk as a breakwater, you mean sink her in the harbor, or maybe as an ammunition storage ship. And so they towed her to Guam, what was left of her. And they left her there until 1956. At one point, a typhoon caused her to break her moorings and run 500 nautical miles away before a massive sea and air search was able to locate her and drag her back. And then in 1956, she was towed to Japan and scrapped. And that's a common feature of many of the ships on my list, is they refuse to die. And when they are finally sold for scrap, I believe unwarranted, they run away. And they put up a fight. And so Oregon put up her fight, but eventually in 1956 was scrapped in Japan. In my number 6 spot, I have the battle cruiser Yavuz, or Sultan Selim Yavuz, or Gobin. Yavuz was not scrapped until 1973. She served in the Turkish Navy through World War I and World War II, and as a member of the NATO fleet during the Cold War. There are some great pictures out there of her tied up side by side with battleship Missouri post-World War II, when the United States used Missouri to take the Turkish ambassador back to Istanbul. Yavuz started life as the Imperial German battlecruiser Gobin, and quite famously, early in World War I, she was isolated from Germany and, rather than fleeing for home, ran for Turkey, and the Germans traded her for Turkey in exchange for Turkey entering the war, or I guess at that point the Ottoman Empire, in exchange for them entering the war on the side of the Central Powers. So by giving up a battleship that they would have otherwise lost, battle cruiser, that they would have otherwise lost, they bring another major power into the war on their side. A great exchange. And Turkey, the Ottoman Empire, continues to run Gobin with a joint German and Turkish crew throughout the war. She is basically the most powerful warship in the Black Fleet for her entire career. She's not decommissioned until 1954. In 1965, the Turkish government offers her to the West Germans to turn her into a museum ship. At that point, she's the only Imperial German ship of any consequence left anywhere in the world, the last member of the High Seas Fleet, the last battle cruiser, and the only dreadnought-type ship left anywhere in the world besides the battleship Texas, which is already successfully operating as a museum at this point. The West Germans turn the Turks down, they hold her for about another decade, and then scrap her. And so this ship, she's historically significant, sure, but in terms of her design and development is massively significant. So losing this last connection to battle cruisers, the High Seas Fleet, World War I, and the Dreadnought era was a true loss to mankind. Number 5, USS Hartford. Hartford was a wooden-hulled, steam-powered frigate. She served as Admiral Farragut's flagship during the Battle of Mobile Bay, and was on her decks, well, tied up in her rigging, that Admiral Farragut famously says, "Damn the torpedoes, full speed ahead," and runs his fleet into Mobile Bay to engage Confederate ironclads and shore batteries, and eventually is able to take the bay. Hartford was preserved like many wooden-hulled ships in the years after the Civil War, and used as a floating barrack ship, a store ship, a warehouse ship in a number of places throughout the country, and was one of those most significant ships still in existence that Roosevelt earmarked for inclusion in his National Museum of the U.S. Navy. So she was taken to D.C., and she was left there. And she sat there from the late 40s until 1956, when the lack of attention and maintenance caused her to sink at her moorings, at which point she possibly could have been raised and preserved. However, she was broken up and scrapped instead. During the time that Hartford languished, Constitution had gone through 2 major restoration efforts, which famously restored the ship and preserved her, allowing her to be left. And Constellation had been towed to Baltimore to be opened as a museum. So Constellation is another Civil War-era wooden-hulled vessel, which was preserved under similar circumstances. So Hartford could very well have been salvaged, and had she been salvaged, she could still very well be in existence today. Number 4, USS Cabot. Cabot was an Independence-class light carrier. She served throughout World War II in both the Atlantic and the Pacific, and in the post-war years, she was given to Spain as the Spanish Navy's only aircraft carrier, Delgado. When the Spanish Navy decommissioned her in 1989, she was given to a U.S. organization which had formed to turn her into a museum. This happens in 1990. She's towed to New Orleans, and she languishes there for a decade while this organization tries to get their stuff together. Because she was donated from Spain and not from the Navy, they had much less strict guidelines for acquiring the vessel, and they didn't have a good financial plan in place. Around 2000, after a decade of no work being done and no money being raised to pay for her berthing fees, she was cut up for scrap, and by 2001 she ceased to exist. She would have been the only example of light or escort carriers, of which we built over 100 during World War II. And so her loss is a massive loss to that period of history. There are 5 aircraft carrier museums in this country that are all operating perfectly fine, so there's no reason to believe that she wouldn't have been able to. She would have been moored on the Gulf Coast, which has traditionally been a pretty favorable place for museum ships to be. However, the organization running her just couldn't get their stuff together. The ship was scrapped. Major parts of the ship, including the entire island, were salvaged and went to other museums. The museum that the island was taken to went defunct and closed, and the island was eventually scrapped. So, unfortunately, Cabot was unlucky as a museum ship, and her loss and her organization's inability to get their stuff together gives other legitimate museum ships a bad name, and their incompetence destroyed our maritime history. In my number 3 spot, I have another ship arguably lost to incompetence. That is HMS Implacable, formerly the French ship Duguay-Trouin, which, if you actually speak French, tell me the right way to pronounce that in the comment section down below. She was a 74-gun ship of the line, which was sunk by the Royal Navy in 1949. Duguay-Trouin had been built around 1800. She served throughout the Napoleonic Wars. She was one of only a handful of French ships to survive the Battle of Trafalgar in French colors, although she was captured within a month. And then she served in the Royal Navy all the way up until 1949. She would have been the only example of the 74-gun ship of the line left in the world today, which was the real workhorse of the Napoleonic Wars. Only HMS Victory was an older museum ship than her in the United Kingdom. So this vessel was hugely significant for this major period of global conflict. Following World War II, with post-war austerity measures, Great Britain began to get rid of a lot of the ships in its fleet, including recently built ships, but also going back to the older sailing vessels that were still being used as storeships and warehouses, basically the same thing that Hartford was kept around for in the United States. And they offered her back to France so that the French could turn her into a museum. Well, unfortunately, France was in no better condition than Great Britain in the post-war years, and they turned them down. So a British and French flag on HMS Implacable towed her into the English Channel, set scuttling charges, and sunk her. And this happened recently enough that there are photographs of them doing this. By the time that they do this, Texas is already operating as a museum ship. And so she could have been saved. Unfortunately, in the United Kingdom, which has arguably more naval tradition than in the United States, there are far fewer ships preserved and a far smaller percentage of ships preserved. In my number 2 spot, HMS Warspite. Warspite has perhaps the greatest name ever given to a battleship. She served throughout World War I, where she was heavily damaged during the Battle of Jutland, throughout World War II, where she fought in basically all theaters of conflict, the Mediterranean, the Atlantic, the Indian Ocean. She was hit by a guided missile, for Christ's sake. Like she served from basically the Dreadnought era into the age of missiles. And she was decommissioned after World War II, like many of the other pre-war battleships around the world. In 1947, she was scrapped alongside all of her other Dreadnought sister ships in the United Kingdom. However, Warspite, throughout her career, was able to earn 15 battle honors, the British equivalent of the American battle stars, making her, I believe, the most decorated vessel in Royal Navy history. And so, arguably, if you were going to save any Royal Navy battleship, and it's a crime that none of them were saved, she would have been the one to keep. Warspite did not go down without a fight. On her way being towed to the scrappers, she parted her tow line and ran aground. After tremendous effort trying to raise the ship, she ran aground again. In the effort to raise the ship, she badly damaged at least 2 of the salvage vessels, and she had to be partially dismantled in place before finally being scrapped. And she remains the largest salvage operation ever conducted in the United Kingdom. This ship, said to have had a mind of her own. In combat, often her steering failed. Famously, at Jutland, she veered out of the line of battle to take fire off of the British armored cruiser squadron that was being shot to pieces, and suffered a lot of damage in that way. At other times during her career, she also suffered steering casualties, which caused her to veer out of the line of battle into positions that helped her save other ships or proved advantageous to the British, and she always got away. She took damage for sure, but she always got away. During the Battle of Narvik, she obliterated a German destroyer squadron. Like I said, in the Mediterranean, she takes a cruise missile hit, a guided glide bomb, but she takes a very modern hit that she was never designed to. She provided gunfire support during the invasion of Normandy. How this ship was saved, I will never know. And now, in the number 1 spot, you guys have probably guessed it, USS Enterprise CV-6. The Big E is perhaps the most historically significant ship in the U.S. Navy. She earned 20 battle stars, the only ship to ever earn more than Battleship New Jersey. She was basically the only carrier in the Pacific for large parts of World War II. She participated in the Doolittle raid on Japan. She was one of Halsey's flagships. She fought throughout the Guadalcanal campaign. Her squadrons were instrumental to the American victory at Midway. Her list of battle honors goes on and on. I cannot name all the battles she was in from memory. She was in so many of them. This ship took hit after hit after hit and was repaired and thrown back into the fight only to take more hits. And during this time, sister carriers like Lexington, Yorktown, Hornet, and Wasp all succumbed while she took similar levels of punishment but always got back into the fight. She was not scrapped until 1958, and as early as 1946, the state of New York was working with the Navy to take this ship as a museum ship. They had Admiral Halsey's support, and they still weren't able to garner enough support to make it happen. So by 1949, that plan had fallen out, and again, in 1958, she is finally scrapped. Unfortunately, the U.S. Navy had a number of much more modern carriers, and so they were looking to get rid of her fast. If she had been held in the reserve fleet, like a number of the more modern battleships, she would have probably fared better, because she was being gotten rid of at the very, very beginning of museum ships. And so we didn't know how to operate museum ships yet. They weren't able to garner enough support. And perhaps the most historically significant vessel in the entire Navy was lost. So that just further proves that we don't choose to preserve the most historically significant vessels as museums. We choose the ones that resonate with us. We choose the ones that are available at the time, or we don't choose. We reach out and say, hey, we want a museum ship to revitalize the failing economy in X city or Y city. And you end up with the ship you can get. Pretty famously, recently, the city of Mayport, Florida, has been trying to get a museum ship. And they've bounced. At one point, I think they were looking for an aircraft carrier. They've tried to get more modern ships. They tried to get USS Adams, and now they're trying to get the USS Orlick. They're just trying to get whichever ship they can. In this case, Orlick is massively historically significant and has already operated as a museum ship, but they aren't necessarily trying to get the best one. They're trying to get whatever's available. And that's the case with most museum ships. Should all 4 Iowa-class battleships be preserved? Arguably, no. Only one of them is enough of an example. But all 4 Iowas were around and available in the heyday of museum ship acquisition, and so they have all been preserved. Should they have been preserved when the standard type battleships that survived the attack on Pearl Harbor were scrapped? Maybe not. Were South Dakota and Washington more historically significant than the Iowas or North Carolina or the surviving South Dakotas? Arguably they were, and yet they were not the ones that were able to garner support to be saved. So I really want to see you guys' lists of top 10 vessels to be saved down in the comment section. Again, I'm going to make another video in the next couple of weeks that is the top 10 types of ships I would like to see an example of preserved, which will be more nebulous. I won't be naming specific ships like Warspite. I will be saying, hey, I wish we had saved any British battleship. I don't care if it was Vanguard with no historical significance or Dreadnought, which exemplifies an entire type, an entire revolution in naval design. So for this video, make your comments pretty specific on the names of ships. Which ship would I have liked to have seen that I didn't include on this list? The American large cruiser USS Alaska. That's my honorable mention. She's not historically significant to make this list, but darn it, she's purdy. Battleship New Jersey receives operating support from the New Jersey Department of State. We also receive support from a number of other organizational and individual sponsors, including viewers like you. There's a link in the description for ways you can donate. Your support has allowed us to go from making 1 video a week to making 5 videos a week. So remember to like, share, and subscribe so that you're notified when we put out more content. Thanks for watching.